Hello and welcome back to Crew Parley. Most of the videos on this channel are Parley, a sort of call and response thing that I do where folks who support me at a certain tier through Patreon and such submit a prompt and then I respond to the prompt with a video. This is the opposite. I get to pick the prompt and people at a lower tier of support all get to respond and then I do a video about the responses. So my prompt, I guess I won't put up the little topic text thing because this usually indicates that someone else is speaking. It's my prompt, and I said, how do you determine which games give you the most enjoyable build crafting experience? Pretty straightforward. What mix or mixes of quality and quantity of build making goodness do you consider really fun? What even is quality for a bout of build making? And we got some responses. This is only the second time I'm doing these since we brought them back, so there's only a few people responding. But that's okay, they have a lot to say. So let's go through them. I will briefly say why I asked this prompt, I guess elaborate a little bit more. Yeah, it's not the same thing as asking what you think good build making is. Not the same as asking what you think good build systems are or what games have good build systems. How do you define that for yourself, or how do you determine what those games might be? How do you find those games? Maybe we got a good response about that. Stuff like that, if that makes sense as a distinction. And I'm interested in that because I've realized that the way I talk about build systems and making builds in games probably ought to shift, would do well to shift, to account for the fact that we're in kind of a weird state of the industry with build systems. I've said a lot that I think one of the inciting incidents of my channel and career doing this is that I don't think that the industry is in a very good place with build systems. I feel like they're often kind of a secondary thought or like a byproduct of other design decisions. We'll get into it later. And as a result, there are a lot of build systems out there, or games that seem very focused on making builds, that are not very far into the philosophy of what would make that good, in my opinion. And so maybe it doesn't really make sense to say, well, what are good build systems currently? Because what they are currently is just the ones that sort of stumbled their way to being effective in this weird state of affairs we had. Not necessarily the ones that would be good in a meditation plane that does not exist, where build systems were great. And so why not ask about that? That seems like the more relevant thing to know. And so I did. And we got some great responses. So let's get into it right away. Liquid begins saying, there are some questions that I ask myself when it comes to a build making game to determine if I enjoy it greatly. Well, what a coincidence. Very nice. Let's hear them. Do I enjoy the basic building blocks of the game as a whole to want to probe deeper? Yep, pretty straightforward. If you don't like what's on offer, then don't continue. Can I do a variety of different things with what I'm offered? And am I happy to go back for more, whether for shits and giggles or actual progression? So again, the first thing may be obvious. Do you enjoy the basic building blocks as a whole enough to want to probe deeper? Maybe you don't, and then you don't continue, but let's assume you do. Is there a lot to do? Can I do a variety of different things with what I'm offered? Maybe looking into one build shows you things you haven't considered for other builds. Maybe in playing a build, you don't like it initially, but there's a different build that lets you do what you wanted from the first build. Maybe there's a different class of build, magic versus physical weaponry or something, that can do your first build idea in better ways, whether objectively it's more powerful and you didn't think it was that powerful, or subjectively you find this way of doing the thing more fun. And so forth. Games that can do that earn my continued attention. And then there's that question of longevity. Am I happy to go back for more, whether for shits and giggles or actual progression? Is there an incentive to keep coming back? Is there steady progression tied to it? Making builds or playing the game? Or is it just fun on its own merits? Perhaps both. You've either done the progression the game offers and you're just screwing around with the game's build systems because the options to discover are enticing, or you're still progressing towards some kind of reward at your own pace. Maybe the game has an actual end goal and isn't a live service offering, and your builds are a means to an end. Yeah, really sensible summary. I am always, but in particular here, quite impressed with how fully formed the responses often are. This is cool. In my notes, I have this thing about how you're kind of describing there as being phases to how you experience many of these build systems, which I find really relatable. So there's kind of early phase where you notice that the game has build systems. In many games currently, you do not fully engage with those systems right away or for a significant amount of the game's runtime. You maybe have a lot of spaces for gear or mod slots or whatever that you can't or don't fill until a lot later in the game, but you still see those systems often pretty early on. Do you like them? Do they interest you? Do they seem like they would be fun? How does the game kind of give you a carrot that makes you more interested to go deeper? Maybe you don't. There are certainly plenty of games I've played where the game has build systems very early on. It telegraphs that it will have them later. But I'm concerned enough with the content of those systems that I don't keep going. So certainly, while it might be obvious to say, do you enjoy the basic building blocks enough to go deeper, as still a big sticking point for many games, I think. And then as the game goes on, it maybe opens up in some way. So in your example, you talked about an experience I've had a lot of times where you get some build options and you use them in a way that seems straightforward, and that's fine, but you discover that there are less straightforward ways to apply these items. Recently, I got a game. I did get a game called Remnant 2, and in Remnant 2, I was playing and got a lot of fire damage related gear and burning, which is the fire damage status effect, naturally. Every elemental damage type has an amulet and a ring that are the same except for what color they are, basically, that boost that elemental damage type. So it was a thing I was aware was broadly available in the game. You can make an elemental damage based build, and there are various trade-offs to doing so. But I also got a ring that said you do more damage. Enemies that are burning take more damage from all sources. You do more damage to them. This didn't seem to be available for the other status effects, and there are some more status effect related things for some other statuses as well, like bleed, that are not regularized. It's not like there are no other items that inflict, corrosive or overloaded the other elemental statuses in this game, but not necessarily as many pieces. And so, maybe I'll make a burning build. It seems like there's a little more support for that. I'm very early on in the game. I don't have a lot of stuff. Let's find a way to do pure, fire damage and inflict burning. And so it happened. And that was fine and all. It's a lot of space just for modest damage increases. It's not really an engine. And games often start this way. They'll give you things that fairly obviously would work well together. And you've got a lot of rings competing for space in this game, so you might swap them in and out. But of course, that ring was really burning a hole in my pocket, quite literally. Boo, I know. Because you could just inflict burning and then bank the damage bonus for something else. It doesn't have to be a full fire build. And I have experienced in my time making builds that this tends to be a more powerful approach to using these items, if that is what you want. I wanted the all heat build, the all fire build. But I was also interested in, okay, you inflict burning and you're basically making the burning status effect be a damage multiplier for other sources of damage. That sounds cool, okay, sure. Maybe I'll look out for something like that. And when the game has a robust response to that, it's very fulfilling. You start to feel like, okay, that's the moment where I feel like these pieces are modular, I guess, in a way. They're intended to be picked apart and put together different ways. They're obviously useful. There's no question that, that is basically good if you use it in the right situation. And I think that's great. Getting that out of the way is generally good. And I think Remnant 2 does this very well, for what it's worth. But then as you move forward through the game, you see that there are lots of different ways to use it. A pretty robust package of stuff in the game exists for multiple status effects. You inflict a lot of different effects. I found something that when you inflict 4 different effects, you make enemies take more damage from all sources. Ooh, and then you also, one of those 4 effects is burning, and then that makes them take more damage from all sources. And then you could make a whole kind of team buffing damage or enemy debuffing thing against opponents. And another of the ways that you can increase allies' damage happens to be applied through a status effect. You glitch out enemies, and then if they die, they drop a thing, which if it's picked up, increases your damage. but it counts as a status effect while it's applied. So that's 2 down, and they already increase my allies' damage. If I can find 2 more, then we're good. And that's not the only approach. That isn't the approach I ended up taking. That's not the only approach you could take. But you see what I mean. It began to open up that way. That's really relatable to me, Liquid. I thought that was a great play-by-play of how that often happens, at least for me. However, something I find really interesting about this way of describing experiencing a build system is that it's very specific to games that are not about builds very much early. So I'll get into Liquid. You included some example games that fulfill one or both of those bigger sticking points for you. Can the game offer a variety of things to do with what you're offered? And are you happy to go back for more, whether for shits and giggles or actual progression? Games that do those things well for you. Warframe, Elden Ring, Fallout 3 and New Vegas, Hades, Skyrim, certain Fire Emblem entries, Oblivion, maybe some others don't immediately come to mind. Some of these I come back to on a frequent basis to keep messing around with because they're that enjoyable, and the variety in their build systems is enough for your specific conditions. I think this is a really interesting way to describe it. There's almost this feeling like as the game's other content dwindles, you're experiencing less and less new content of other kinds when you play the game. In many of these games, that has an inverse relationship to the build system. You get more and more build system as you're getting less and less, I'm not really doing the hand gestures right, of the other parts of the game. And so you kind of need it to be that you flirt with the basic building blocks and then it opens up, because it doesn't open up early on. In Warframe, you have a ton of mod slots early on that you can't fill because you don't have the mod capacity, and wouldn't be able to fill anyway because you don't have enough mods that do anything to fill them. Same thing in Hades in one way. You don't really gain the control you will later have over the build options. And I believe at the beginning of Hades, you're not even offered the ability to get many Olympians that you can later get. So it is largely about just fitting damage into your loadout however you can early on, and trying to assert agency with making a build is mostly non-existent early in the game. It's interesting how Hades 2 has put that online much earlier in your time playing, and you can also increase how fast you get to it a lot more than you can in Hades 1. That early game stage has significantly sped up to the point that I feel like it begins feeling like a turning point. There are other types of games I've experienced where it's not like this. It isn't like almost everything you've described, where the beginning of the game is kind of you experience the game and the build system emerges toward the end, almost waxing as the rest of the game wanes. And there are definitely games that don't do that as well. I would broadly imagine that there are about 2 big buckets of build systeminess, one where that happens and another one where it doesn't. I feel like it kind of happens in reverse in many of these games. You do a lot of build stuff early on, and then you kind of focus on playing. These aren't always necessarily, it's not necessarily in a good way. So if you play Dungeons and Dragons, for example, or a good amount of tabletop role-playing games, they're notorious for having the problem that you need to make a very involved amount of build decisions right away before you know anything about the game the first time you play. You're picking, your starting class and your race and your background and things that can have knock-on effects for your build down the line, decisions you can't change normally that affect your build going forward, but which you need to make before you've played the game ever, quite possibly. Now, this is fine, you can just do it. But if you want to make a build, there definitely is this feeling of it makes respecking kind of challenging. Talk to your game master, maybe they'll just let you respec, but it's not inherently baked into the game very much, and it would be quite hard to go back, change a bunch of stuff. In a way, you could argue that respecking your pen and paper character sheet erases a lot of the story of the character, which is the sheet. I, as a game master in my own games, ask my players to please use physical character sheets, even though it's very easy and you could argue streamlines the game in some ways to use an online tabletop role-playing game manager, because I think that that sort of creates a bit of a story as you go. While the respecking thing is, but it's really a topic for another time, you see my point. These are games where the build experience is quite front-loaded, not at all loaded to the back of your experience of the game. And in fact, the game really only gets going more, you're waxing the amount of content that you're experiencing as the amount of build decisions you're making wanes as you level up over and over again, and your build is largely locked in unless you were to respec. You make most of the build decisions right away, actually even before gameplay starts, and then you go into the game. Yeah. Pretty interesting. These are tricky because to some extent, like, that's just bad. Like, not knowing that, what you're going to experience in the game or being able to adapt as you go, that is one of the key aspects of making a build, in my opinion. We'll actually get to that in a minute because someone else brought that up too. But at the same time, I think the idea stands. There aren't a ton of games right now in the industry at this moment in time, October 2024, that are structured more like that, where a lot of the build decisioning is more front-loaded, and then there's a kind of a reverse relationship where you play the game more and maybe you reap the rewards of your build, but you're not making more build decisions. But there's no reason those games couldn't exist. There are plenty of designs you could make that would be that way. We just don't currently have a lot of them. At least I don't have them to hand. Maybe they exist and I'm just not thinking of them. Certainly there are, if you count things like D&D, that example, there are lots of, video game adaptations of that. So I suppose there are a lot of them in that sense, but many of the build systems we think of open up as the game goes on, not kind of lead the game off and then you experience your build as you go. And roguelikes are probably the elephant in the room here, which I think are often kind of in the middle. I said I thought Hades took a little while to get going, but not within a play session necessarily, just like when you start your save file. A lot of roguelikes, I think, are more like a middle ground. Either your build kind of emerges as you go. Certainly, depending on the design, it might be that you make the more decisive build decisions at the beginning of the run or toward the end of the run, or not particularly one or the other. Sort of outside the scope of this, but I just thought I'd address it compared to my model. Is the game kind of front-loaded or back-loaded with its build decisions? And it might be trying to even that out as well, which that's cool. That's cool. I think Hades actually does that fairly well once you get going, but certainly not toward the beginning of your time playing. Anyway, very, very useful start. Wow, you set a bar high. This was the first response to the prompt. Liquid, you also said to cut the following from the video if you're pressed for time or would prefer not to cannibalize time spent for other submissions, but you want to talk about the conspicuous absence from that list of games you gave, for those who know you personally, is Honkai Star Rail, which for you answers all three questions positively to the strongest degree at this time. And I read through this example and I think it's useful. I will honor your request and put it at the end of this discussion, but I think it's a pretty cool example. So we'll go back to that. Great idea and very considerate of you. I want to go to Mr. Foot's response. True Parley Grandmaster Foot begins in a similar way. For me, there are three-ish parts to good build systems: interesting decisions, the ability to gain an advantage, and the ability of the game to fight back in an interesting manner. Now, very different from the ones Liquid laid out. A lot more focused on difficulty as well. I'm going to jump over something I think is very interesting that you said, Mr. Voot, so forgive me. But first, quality one, meaningful decisions, interesting decisions. Every degree of freedom in a build game should matter. There should be multiple compelling options, and I should want to equip more than I can. This is pretty interesting. This is a place where you can see how, like, I can imagine many people would disagree, but I agree with you, and certainly it is what you would prefer. Like, to me, I'm not convinced that you need opportunity cost, which is what I would call this quality, for a build experience to feel good, but I sure do. And it's something that I want to sit on more and hear more people's input on. But I am leaning in the direction of opportunity cost is one of the few defining characteristics of it. It doesn't feel like a build to many people unless it has this, whether they would identify that or not. So I certainly understand where you're coming from. And for you, a very defined point is that there are meaningful decisions. It's not that you just have the option between things, but it's not, I almost want to say something like high stakes. And I really like the want to equip more than you can. This can be achieved a lot of ways, of course. In a lot of games, what happens is that there are very focused options that are often a little more powerful, but do various specific things for a given strategy. Fire and burning, for example, from my example before. But then there will also be things that you can equip in the same slots, ring slots in the case of Remnant 2, that are generally good. They're basically always helpful. And so in theory, you would kind of like to have them at all times. This is just not critical. They don't get the build off the ground, but, do you really need that fourth fire damage increase? Or would it be okay to equip this ring that brings you back to life if you would die once every 2 minutes? Something like that. I think that's actually kind of mediocre in Remnant 2 because it leaves you pretty vulnerable, but that's by the by. Anyway, so yes, very, very sensible start. Quality 2, there should be an advantage in certain situations for specializing my build to that situation. If all builds end up with the same power in all cases, then there's no point to the build system. It's just a really interesting one for me. My personal opinion is maybe actually the same, but I think a little bit different. So it's that line. If all builds end up with the same power in all cases, then there's no point to the build system. So what I wrote in my notes is I feel like it's not good if that becomes too dramatic, though. So my example would be, let's say that the game boss fights in a given game often have ads. There are minions spawned to attack you. Remnant 2 does this a lot. Usually the ads drop ammo, and that's how you can get ammo refills, very elegantly providing an additional challenge, but it's also at that moment that you kind of get to restock. I really like that piece of design. I think it works pretty well. It's not true in every fight to the same extent, and there are some fights where there are probably no ads. So if you have a build that is good at area of effect damage or killing basic enemies, you might imagine that this wouldn't be that strong in boss fights, and I think that that is a flaw with many games' build systems. Builds that are convenient to use normally are suddenly terrible if things get hard, and you don't always know that that situation is going to come about. I think that's broadly bad. Now, the build specializing in killing, fodder enemies isn't bad. You building a tool that is intended to be good for a specific situation is practically buildcraft. That's practically the definition of the idea. If you can't build a specific thing, are you really making a build? But to me, it's important that the impact of that build specializing is modest, like that, noticeable, but not too severe. It doesn't utterly trivialize this aspect of the game, but then is useless in this other aspect of the game if you have not made the build very extreme. Like if you do everything in your power to make the build lopsided, that's one thing. But if specializing a little bit on AoE makes the build, useless against bosses, I'm not sure how this would happen, but I think that is bad. I think it is nice for the build to be like a bit stronger against, multiple small enemies, and then maybe bosses in the game. Most bosses, that's a valuable asset. It's a choice you can make. Do you want to be good against those ad phases for the boss? And on most bosses, that will be relevant, and it might be better on some than others, but it's like good and reasonable as an investment on many. But then there are a few bosses where it maybe isn't good, and a few bosses where it's really good. Doesn't utterly trivialize it unless you go extremely hard in that direction, but it is like noticeably better, yes. To me, there's a balance to be struck here, but I definitely take your point very well, and I hope it doesn't sound like me saying it's wrong to value that at all. Just comparing it to the way I feel, certainly I value this quality, but I often think it's pretty bad if it goes too far. I don't like the idea that the game shows me, oh, were you to drop everything and engineer a build specifically to counter this situation, it would fall apart like a wet cardboard. That doesn't thrill me because it makes me feel like I'm always much worse off unless I do that. The difficulty can feel like it's becoming balanced for that type of play rather than the build I want to use, and then I sleep in the bed I made for myself, with the boss. I really hate ads, so I made a build that has better AoE, and I lose a bit of damage, and that's fine. That's what I wanted, or I decide, like, who cares about the ads? I'll just bring a grenade launcher and otherwise ignore that as a problem in my build, and then, fine, if that's what you want. You're doing more damage to the boss when the ads spawn. Your plan is only okay, but that's what you decided, big deal. So I don't know, to me, this is a tenuous balance. Feeling your build like it's kind of stronger against certain things, I definitely agree is a sensible thing to want. I guess for me, there's a difference between that and having it be that some encounters are lopsided enough that you'd really notice if you built a build to specialize against them. Another aspect of this for me is that the game's encounters be somewhat of a known quantity, that there be some known parameters that I can build around. In Remnant 2, for example, that ads thing is pretty reliable. So were you to build an AoE weapon to deal with those situations, a healthy 80 to 90% of the time that will be the case. And so you can kind of take that as a given. You don't know what every boss is going to be like, but the game has a basic language that you understand and can therefore engage with. You're making a build with a relatively known quantity to interact with. Will I be able to, hit in an AoE and pick up ammo during the fight? Like, yes, the game says. Largely, yes. So I don't know. But I certainly agree that having all the builds feel the same in all cases is almost objectively bad. Like, that sort of makes it pointless. But all builds having the same power level in all cases is desirable, in my opinion. I think that's good. I just want them to have the same power level in a vacuum in all cases, but then, like, how you use them, I guess that's nitpicking terms. If what you mean is, like, this build feels completely different to this other build, but it does good AoE, so it feels more powerful in these situations, yeah, I mean, I guess that makes sense to me. Might sound like nitpicking, but I actually think this is a big point. It's a significant defining factor of what it means to make something specific when you make a build system, and it's connected to the complicated issue of build systems allowing you to make ultra narrow tools. Like, is that good? It's almost impossible to prevent, but then how does it feel to use those tools, Anyway. Quality 3, balance and power ceilings. If my build regularly breaks the game in half, the buildcraft stops mattering. This more or less completes the point I was making before. Builds need weaknesses that the game can abuse. If you have a glass cannon and your weakness is that you die quickly, but the enemies die so fast that they never get to attack, then the balance is bad, and that's not a meaningful choice. The best and the worst thought out builds should still be fun to play. A simple way around that problem is to have multiple types of tasks, for example, Warframe mission types, that can take advantage of or punish certain specialized builds. Sure, and it helps a lot if those are somewhat optional as well. Warframe and Remnant 2 are both good examples where there are some activities that very disproportionately benefit certain kinds of builds, but they are somewhat optional as well. So if you really don't want to play that kind of build, you usually don't have to. And then you can make a specialized version of it as a tool to, address those situations. I agree. Very good overall, elegant tool for figuring that stuff out. And I would argue Warframe goes a step further in making it feel like it's valuable to get things done quickly. I guess many games do that. So if you make a specialized tool, not only can you kind of get value in an additional way, you can win more, as per se, do something easy, but do it in such a masterful way that you get a reward beyond just clearing the fight. You clear the fight really fast, which gives you, well, the most valuable thing of all, your time back. Another nice advantage is that it can potentially pay you back the time you spent investing in a build. That's definitely something that I would look for more in games. Like, I would love to experience that more myself. Having it be that the game rewards a well thought out build and gives you the tools to think out a build well enough that you can spend time not attempting a fight, but instead making a build to address the fight, and then that pays off. Like, you end up doing it faster than if you had just tried over and over again. That appeals to me very highly. or even saving time prior. In Arknights, if you've seen me play Arknights on the stream, I have a very prominent part of my account where I've set up a blind attempt team. I call it the scouting team. This team is designed very different from a normal Arknight squad to be adapted for me not knowing what the content is. So I don't know where enemies are going to spawn from. I don't know what kind of damage, if any, is going to come in against my units. I have basically no information going in. I'm doing the fight blind. Now, in Arknights, you don't get details on the enemies, like what their abilities are and stuff, like a boss, until you've done the fight once. Now, I could look it up, but it's so much easier. In fact, it's often literally faster, depending on your internet speed, to just do the fight once. And so it can be fun to see how I can fare. Sometimes I can manage it with this team. So it lacks things like I don't have healers because I don't know if any damage is coming into my units and also where it will come from. I wouldn't know where to put the healer. I don't have very dedicated tanks because they may or may not be useful. I might be able to just hurl damage at the enemies and overcome them. And if there aren't a lot of enemies to be blocked, my tank will do nothing. My damage always does something, and the solutions might be all things being equal even. So it favors damage output. I don't have any arts damage units because in Arknights, armor mitigating physical damage mitigates a flat amount. If you have 100 armor, you take 100 less of any hit of physical damage. But arts resist, like magic resistance basically, is a percentage resistance. All incoming damage is reduced by that percent, 25%, let's say. Therefore, if you do high hit single physical damage, that will be mitigated by basically nothing. Only enemies that have tremendous defenses of both kinds will not take a lot of damage from that. If they have high armor, well, you do a very large individual number of physical damage that will overcome that 700 armor and still do, a lot of damage. Whereas if it was arts damage, an enemy with high arts resist will still resist a lot of it, a high percent of it. So the team has basically 0 arts damage. Only a little bit to counter those very tanky enemies you might sometimes see, but high individual hit physical damage. It has lots of stuns so that I can figure out what the heck is going on. It has a lot of units that can adapt to being placed on a high or low ground tile because I don't know how many of each I'm going to have. What if I have a lot of ranged units, but there aren't a lot of ranged tiles in a good spot? Well, this loadout has a good portion of its potentially ranged units, such that they can be placed on a low ground tile just in case they need to be. And it's been very fun, very effective. It doesn't at all break the game in half, though. You really notice the lack of those qualities when the fight really wants them. Is there elemental damage coming in or a really tanky boss that you want to block? Well, my loadout is hedging its bets on not needing that, so I really notice that you don't have it. In a way, I almost feel like this squad is a testament to Arknight's relative balance, because there are weaknesses to that squad, and the game does abuse them. You notice them when they come up. You can't make an Omni squad that is good against everything. The game definitely succeeds in that basic parameter that if you build something specific, you notice that you have that specific benefit. It's strong enough in its niche, dramatic enough in its power and its way that it's good, that you don't think that things are broadly just strong most of the time. If you play Arknights, yeah, like the Vanguards, I know, but mostly it's really good. And to be fair, to make the Vanguard situation bad, you have to have very heavily invested units. Like it's not a problem for everyone's account, but yeah, that is definitely a flaw. Anyway, the fast redeploys, yeah, whatever, it doesn't matter. I think this is a great point. Yes. Having it be that the glass cannon problem, I think it's funny you brought that up as the example, Mr. Foot. I feel like that is one of that's like the marquee example of the problem. It's almost always you can just build damage and delete the fight. I think in a way one of Remnant 2's successes is that you largely cannot do this. That for the most part the enemies have enough health, the bosses hard to do big damage to often enough that you would always make use of defensive options if you had them. You might choose not to, you might just prefer not to do that playstyle, but you would be able to make use of them. You cannot just bowl over the fight with raw damage. At least I haven't generally experienced that. If I just smacked my mic, I'm sorry. I was bowling over the sound quality. But yeah, a great way to describe it. And Mr. Fruit, you asked your own prompting question. Not sure that's allowed. No, it's fine. How do you recognize these qualities in games you might want to play? That's a oh, you're responding to maybe your own question too. Honestly, aside from games focusing on builds, I haven't found a good way aside from trying a lot of games. A good build system doesn't have to perfectly fulfill all three qualities you set out, but it shouldn't fail at any of them. Sure. And it's not a bad question for me too. Yeah, I mean, I think you have a really good answer in your own response. That's why I was kind of confused when I got to this part. Because at the beginning of your response, I tricked the audience. You say, first of all, I believe less games should have build options. Nowadays, it feels like many games include build options just to check a point off of a list. If you were to list the three most important selling points of your game, and Buildcraft is not among them, you probably shouldn't have Buildcraft in your game. Buildcraft is very difficult to get right, and I'd prefer none to a half-baked system. Going back to what I said, how do you determine which games give you the most enjoyable buildcrafting experience? I'd say that games that focus on buildcraft as a main feature are the best place to start. And I would go further and say that this is a good way to determine what games will be a good build experience. Not just a good way to figure out which ones you might have liked the most, but a good way to detect what might be good build systems. How do you recognize the qualities like this in games you might want to play when scouting a game out? What do you look for to detect a whiff of a good build system? That Buildcraft is one of the three most important selling points. Great, that's awesome. I was super impressed reading through this. Yeah, I mean, let's go back a little bit to the less games should have build options. Some people might be thinking, that seems like a weird thing to say. Don't you, Zandy, want the opposite of that? You want games to have more build stuff in them? Well, we're trying to say the games where it makes sense maybe could have them. And we get a lot of white noise where games have build options, but not really because they're trying to make it fun to make builds. And I would like to briefly talk about why I think that is, where that's coming from. It may not be obvious to some people listening. Why would that be the case? There are lots of games, you might ask, that have build options that are not trying to be a good build system. Well, why do they have them then? Aren't the developers just failing to make it a good build system? It's not that the game, isn't trying, and don't you want people to try to make good build systems? Well, I do, but I have it on good authority this is not what's happening. So let's talk about it. Reason number one of two is marketing. This was probably the obvious one to a lot of people. The game is called Assassin's Creed. The fantasy and the focus of the first few of them in the series, of course, but that's far removed from our current reality now, is assassinating people, being an assassin. How do you fight like an assassin? You stealth, basically, more or less. You get some brawling, but mostly in an assassin-y way. But in the more recent games, it seems like the marketing team has noticed that not every human being on planet Earth who has enough money and a computer that can run Assassin's Creed has the fantasy of being an assassin. Therefore, it's Assassin's Creed, but don't worry, if you don't like being an assassin, we'll include the build options to let you not assassinate people and instead be a tank that brawls in the street with a sword and shield. Now, I'm not making any comment about those games themselves being cool. Just that it is a bit tonally confused, no? And you are making it a lot harder to curate the experience. Now, the game has to do the thing for people that like assassinating people and people who like fighting in an open environment. How do you do that effectively? Well, it's going to mean that each of the offerings is quite threadbare, or maybe one of them is way more fleshed out than the other. Basically, the game is less about any individual thing because it wants to be about everything, but that's not free. That has a development cost. They had to encourage the staff to spend a lot of time on a game called Assassin's Creed making melee brawling combat instead. That's not an inherently bad thing to do, but it does have a cost, and I don't think that the Assassin's Creed games currently have a very good answer to that question. How does that not compromise other parts of the experience? And the answer is, well, it just does. It just is shallow in some other parts, which isn't ideal. And so this game, you can kind of detect that the buildcraft won't be that meaningful because in many cases, I think, the developer or the publisher has made the build options quite sparse so that they're not that hard to balance, which to make it at least a little possible to make the game have all these different modes. You'll get gear that says 1% more damage to, humans or whatever. And it's like, okay, it's almost physically impossible to notice that for a human being. So the game is jerking you around a little bit. You have lots of places where you need to make a build option, but it doesn't actually do anything. Part 1.5, actually, there are some games that I've experienced where they appear to have a build system, but they are doing something less common with that system, which is kind of creating an interesting meta device, is I guess how I'll explain it. This is World of Warcraft in my mind. World of Warcraft has 3 talent trees, or vanilla World of Warcraft when I played it 20 years ago, forgive me, I don't know what it's like now, had 3 talent trees. And these are, I think the better way to explain it is fake buildcraft. Like they look and sound and could be real build options, but they're just not. They're secretly not, basically. There's a couple different ways this manifests. Way number 1 is that some classes in World of Warcraft can fill multiple roles. For example, if you're playing a druid, you can be a damage output character. You can also be a tank and draw aggro from the boss and soak damage. And you can also be a healer. But the 3 talent trees aren't different ways to do those things. They are the ways to do those things. If you spec into this tree, that gives you the ability to be a functional full healer, where you don't have that ability otherwise. You have to spec into that tree to gain the one way that you can be a viable healer. There's another talent tree that gives you the one way to be a viable tank, and a third talent tree, the DPS, and there's kind of another DPS thing. We won't get into that much. That's one way in which it's an illusion. The build system looks, maybe not even on purpose, like it's going to be build options, but it sort of secretly isn't, basically. Or it's doing something less common, and so it's not necessarily the game's fault. You might be under the impression that the game is about these build options, but it's sort of not. There's kind of another half too. So there are classes in World of Warcraft, plenty of them, that are all not 3 roles, or they only have 1. They can only do damage output, or they have damage output and a healing thing. So let's say shamans, for example. You can be a healer, a full healer as a shaman, and it's the same story as the druid thing in Vanilla WoW. You can, but you need to spec into the one tree that makes it possible to let you heal. So they're not actually choices of how to heal. You need to use the one tree that enables the ability to be a full healer, basically. Gives you the abilities and healing output, scaling, and stuff. And then there are 2 trees left. Now, these are different ways to do damage. They're both, DPS specs. So now it's a choice, right? Well, usually there is one of them in any given state of WoW's progression, for the first few years that I played anyway, that is mathematically superior damage output. And they're not really easier or harder to play most of the time. Though Final Fantasy XIV would be an interesting topic for another time, where that kind of has been taken into account. There are cases where it's like these DPS options are potato, but this one is harder to operate in some situations, and this one maybe not so much. Or they have different, quirks to how they operate. Pretty interesting situation. But because bosses are very mathematically designed to enrage at a certain time and basically kill you all if you don't beat them by that cutoff point, it matters if a spec does 5% more damage. Now, there's kind of a 2-pronged problem here. It doesn't look like the difference is very significant. On paper, and by on paper I mean not mathematically, just like thinking about it in your head, it looks like these 2 ways of doing damage are pretty close in effectiveness. And the trouble is that they are pretty close in effectiveness. Pretty close. But there's still like a 5 to 10% damage output difference. An amount that no human would notice. When asserting your preference, you would say, that seems to be about as good as this other one. And it is. It's about as good, but it's not quite as good. And because there are 10-minute long boss fights with hard number cutoffs, 10% more damage is absolutely going to make or break whether you beat the fight most of the time. There's really no argument in terms of, playing the combat for playing this other build you might enjoy, even though to a layperson, there's no meaningful difference in the build's damage output. The game offers you what appear to be choices and would be choices if not for the fact that in practice, the game's difficulty kind of unmakes them viable choices. This is a weird situation to go into. You could argue, well, no big deal, right? You're just supposed to know that that's the case. But on the other hand, why are there those multiple options? Now, a good amount of the time in WoW, the answer was that, well, this one is good for PvP. The quality of life of this one is very strong in PvP, but inferior damage output for, doing a raid or whatever. That's not a very good answer either, in my opinion. The screen that looks like it's options, you do have to pick between the options, but you're not actually picking between the options. If you've already decided you want to play the game in this way, there are actually no choices, or not really anyway. You actually have to just pick this, and you might simply not know that, in which case you will suck, which is, yeah, that's not that good. So that's kind of 1.5 as a reason. And then point number 2, remember, these are reasons why a game might include build systems, but not really be trying to make making builds an enjoyable activity, rather than the game just failing at making building an enjoyable activity. What are their motivations for doing that? So reason number 1 was marketing. They want to make the game appear like it would appeal to a wider audience, but then that comes at the cost of making the game too broad. Build systems are not a way that you can simply make the game be more things. The game has to be those things, and then the build system lets you spec into ways to do those things, much of the time anyway. And then point 1.5, the game might not intend anything related to build systems. It might have something else that it uses a system that has all the pieces of a build system for. The game is using a system that has all the makings of a build system for something else that isn't really about, player preference exactly. For a different form of player preference. Okay, reason number 2, maybe the more interesting one, is it's kind of a byproduct. This is what I was saying a lot earlier in the parlay. The idea here is that build systems are a very good fit for a part of the game, and the developers properly conclude this during development and include them. But they do not then go back and say, well, but now our game is kind of about build systems. I kind of think of this one as not following through fully. So, for example, in a given game, you can think of many examples. You might have a lot of puzzles the player is meant to solve, or a lot of boss fights the player is meant to beat. And, well, you want rewards for those fights, right? Those puzzles or whatever. They might be build options. And the game says, oh, cool. We can give the player a really meaningful, memorable, noticeable change in their gameplay to commemorate them defeating this challenge. But the problem is, now the game is full of those options. Now, the player might want to curate a set of those build options to make a specific build. But the game didn't really try to be about that. It was just trying to be about solving those puzzles or beating those bosses. But now, all of the ingredients and functionality for a build system are here, just saddled with the potentially very poor quality of life of needing to go acquire those build options in a way that doesn't have much to do with using them or whatever, acquiring them. You have to do a contrived series of puzzles, let's say, to get, these build options. The game may or may not address this well. It might be, as I have found to be the case sometimes in Remnant 2, that the puzzles are very esoteric. If you want it as a puzzle, you probably won't be able to solve it super quickly. Like, they're puzzles of significant complexity, but they've been designed in such a way that it often seems to me that if you wanted to just look it up, it's almost designed as if to make that quite easy. If you want to look up the solution, what appears to be a really weird puzzle is actually quite easy to bypass if you're just told the solution. So, like there will be an image you can look at that will just give you the solution. Oftentimes looking up the solutions to the puzzles, which I do in Remnant 2 because I don't want the puzzles, I want the build options, is kind of easy. And so, while a little bit awkward, the game has kind of called to that a little bit. But there are lots of games I've experienced where I feel like the build options are just kind of there, and the game hasn't really followed through with making it relevant to have build options, or like what do you use them for example. And again, you can see how this has probably often happened, probably in many cases. The game simply noticed a part of itself that would benefit from rewards like build options, but then they didn't do it a mental step further and say, well, now, whether we like it or not, we've made our game about builds to some extent. We have made a potentially very good build system in our game. We now the game would benefit a lot from going back and trying to make sure that is a good experience. And I think games often just don't do that. This is really a shame when it happens. I think much of the time it's also quite up for debate. I could see people saying that Remnant 2 is like this. I could see me saying Remnant 2 is like this. But I feel like they've done a good enough job balancing and making the different options compelling and making it kind of easy to get them if you don't want to do the puzzle thing. In some cases, really no, but in a lot of cases, yes. That it ends up working out. And if you want to just like make builds and stuff, the game is a pretty robust offering for that. You just have to do some mildly contrived things to get those options. I'll say, I definitely think in those cases, maybe a bad one, you'd say, don't include build systems. But in many cases, I think the game could really get there. You know, you could include a mode that was like explorer mode. You discover stuff and solve puzzles, and the game is a mystery and you find hidden items, or buildcraft mode or whatever. The game doesn't hide those things from you, and instead there's, some other loop that's meant to be satisfying. You get a kind of guide as you go. What might seem like spoiling the puzzles to other people, but what makes it easy to go do some fun challenges for others. I could even imagine the ability to swap in a replacement where, for a puzzle or a challenge that's contrived, if you're just focusing on getting the build options, you could even have the game swap in a different encounter, like a fight or something, so that you do something more in line with the type of gameplay experience you're having. In summary, this type of build making experience is tricky to evaluate as should this game have build options, because the game is like 2/3 of the way to being a game that maybe should have build options, and it just hasn't brought it on home, probably because they came out as a result of the game's other design goals. Again, I have no way of knowing whether in Remnant or any game they actually did think of those build options afterward. It might be that they just don't think this is a problem in the same way. I don't know, it doesn't really matter. My point is just that I think that's also very common. So yeah, really, really cool as a comment to finish this section. The idea that less games having build options and thinking of games as prioritizing their build options being good, being a good yardstick for finding games you want to play. That's great. I'll definitely get a hold on to that. That's awesome. Anyway, I didn't talk about this too much, but the idea of, if your build regularly breaks the game in half, that invalidates the experience for other builds. I feel like we don't need to get into this every single time it comes up, but I will just leave here. Excuse me. It's been a very cold day, so my body is falling asleep while my mind is incredibly awake. I'll just leave here the idea that the community sentiment that if a build is fun for them, they think it doesn't affect other people is just wrong from a development perspective. And in this intimate context where we've been talking for an hour already, I am deciding not to take pains to explain it in what might seem like a more open-minded way. It's quite tiring to see people insistently repeat the idea that, this doesn't, you can just choose not to play with it. It's like, okay, but the point of the activity is that it is an interesting choice to pick this or that. So it doesn't make sense to say, well, but this one being overpowered doesn't affect the experience. It literally does, like it does. And more to the point, it doesn't negatively affect any player in any way if that powerful build is reduced in power level, but is still powerful, just isn't overbearingly powerful. Again, I'll repeat the mantra that has become drilled into my brain over the past few years, that it's more that a lot of people are thinking of bad balance, or they just don't care about other people's experience. That's fine, but that's not a good game development piece of advice. That's you as a player, you're saying, it's fine if this is overpowered. To you, yeah, that's obviously fine. Who cares? But also, who cares? That's not a game design criticism. If you're a game designer, I think it's fair to insist that you do not think about one player and you think about players in general, for which it quite obviously does affect their experience of making a choice if one option is fairly obviously much stronger than others. Certainly, I would say, just as a quick example, for Remnant 2, this is something I found very successful. I feel like the game, it's a good sign when there are a lot of posts in the community about a really broken, overpowered build, but then if you open all of them, they're all significantly different. Very, very nice. It's great. Again, it's not bad for things to be overpowered, but it doesn't have no effect on the design. It's still good, maybe obvious, to engage with what that effect is. Wow, I know why I yawned now. We've been over that a million times to eye patch notes. The primary aspect you look for, eye patch notes, in a game is mutual exclusivity and equivalencies. Now, this may seem natural for a game with equipment slots or party composition, but it goes a bit further than not being able to have two guns at the same time. For something like Warframe, some augments truly are unique, but others are kind of based on a more common mod, such as critical damage or fire rate. The player who wants a specific stat could take the generic mod or lean into the specific flavor and restrictions of the augment. Warframe and other games tend to have all of these mutually exclusive checks on some detached loadout page. Limbus Company, on the other hand, has some interesting decisions to make between which Ishmael identity or which Teth tier ego or whatever, but the decisions move from planning to gameplay with a pretty clear divide. My recent stint of Buildcraft has been toward Survivors likes, named after the runaway hit Vampire Survivors. In addition to gear that cannot exist in the same place, roguelike games have gear that cannot exist in the same time. This is really cool. I'll try to explain it as best I can. Let's read the rest of the thing. Gear that cannot exist at the same time as other gear. The level-by-level progression and lightly randomized gameplay lead to certain special kinds of opportunity cost. Some forms of high-level content in permanent progression games, like Warframe and Genshin Impact, tend to have the bulk of decision-making before the content actually starts. One question I can construct is, how long will this loadout or team last through the game's, ongoing progression? Roguelikes broadly flip this question into, when does this loadout turn on? While both permanent progression and fresh start roguelikes reward having foreknowledge of build possibilities, the latter rewards the systemic understanding of next best options. This is very cool. So the idea here is that in a lot of games, like let's say in Warframe, if you get a mod for a weapon that gives you crit chance or crit damage, it would be pretty pointless for there to be a mod that gives you crit damage, but just less crit damage, if it only gives you less crit damage. It's pretty common in Warframe for a mod like the type you described to exist, where this specific weapon gets its own special crit damage mod that gives you less crit damage but also a unique effect, or more crit damage but only under some specific condition, a certain way of using the weapon. And this makes sense because you always have access to both options. Once you own the mod, you're choosing which of those, or maybe both, that you want to equip. But in a roguelike experience, if you're getting upgrades as you go and they're going to reset when you die, it's suddenly much more interesting to think about weaker, just worse options for things, because the build needs its basic things to get going. If there are more mods that give you crit damage for a weapon, and you get the mods one by one, yeah, I mean, it's better in a new way to have multiple crit damage mods because you can get one of them maybe more likely or sooner. And if there's a weaker option for crit damage, but it's available earlier in a run, well, you have the option to settle for the weaker crit damage, but have some crit damage earlier on in your progression. It becomes relevant to see, okay, well, this is available now. Like, there is that better option that I like, but it simply isn't available now. It might even be guaranteed later. You might be guaranteed to get it later on in the run, or basically guaranteed. But right now, you can't have it. For this amount of the run, you have to deal without. You're playing Hades, and the first few bosses, your build has not been shown Artemis spoons, but you want an Artemis spoon. Well, you're basically guaranteed to get it if it's a basic Artemis spoon. You just have to equip the Artemis keepsake and do the next floor well if you survive that long. And so, what else do you have? And suddenly it becomes very interesting to see what else is available. Yeah, I think this is describing that as like a new dimension of opportunity costs, like things being exclusive in time in some way, or you just can't get it now, is really, really cool. I personally think there's a lot of untapped potential in this idea of like the weaker things being easier to get at some earlier time in progression, and then that may be going away as time goes on. There are many games, good and bad, where I've enjoyed the build system a lot early on, and then I felt differently about it later. In many of the games, I liked it later, but I liked it in a very different way early on. In Arknights, I remember really having a good time with my kind of mid-game experience. The interesting thing is that in Arknights, upgrading characters gets exponentially more expensive after the first kind of breakpoint. They can be promoted twice, and promoting them once and leveling them halfway up to be able to be promoted twice costs like a 20th of the resources of leveling them up all the way. As a result, you get most of the value of each individual unit for a very small comparative opportunity cost if you have limited resources. If we don't assume you're playing forever, and we assume you only had like 3 months to play, you would definitely want to pick and choose which units to, promote twice. In a vacuum, yeah, I mean, you're going to promote them all eventually. So there's no need to say, like, I'm promoting this unit instead of this unit. But if we limited time in some way, suddenly that's a very interesting decision. There's a really strong archetype, or there's a lot of really strong units in this archetype called Centurions. These are guard units that have a mix of tankiness and good damage, and they have a special trait where they can attack every unit they're blocking simultaneously. So if they block 2 units, they can attack both of them at once. Now, if you promote them twice, they get to block 3 units. Doesn't sound like a huge difference, but that means they can attack 3 units at the same time, which in the circumstance where you want a Centurion Guard is unbelievably powerful, like extremely strong. I think this is broadly, some of the units in this category are the strongest units in the game in many cases. Not in many cases, in exactly the right case. But it's not a very significant decision to level them up, right? I mean, they gain so much from hitting that second promotion. Well, I remember an example where, without getting into this too much, most units of most rarities do not unlock any more skills after their second promotion. They do unlock the ability to level their skills further, but the highest rarity units get their third skill after their second promotion. I remember an early game experience I had where I had a Centurion Guard that was not a high rarity unit. So when that unit was first promotion and leveled halfway up, they had all parts of their kit except that one extra block. But it's huge for their effectiveness. And I had another unit that was a high rarity unit where I wanted their skill 3 that you only get if you promote them twice. There was a nuanced decision to make between these two options. It's not just you promote these and you don't promote these. It's, yeah, I mean, there's a complicated network of decision points. Not even taking time to explain that lower rarity units take significantly less resources to promote. And so 4-star units, oh yeah, that highest rarity 6-star tier, they get an extra skill. The 5-star ones, well, maybe they get some big perk. The 4-star units, ooh, but they're so cheap to promote. It's so cheap to promote them twice. So a lot of the time, if they do something kind of unique and they would get the job done in their role, ooh, it's a lot of value to promote those. Certainly the units of that class that exist that are relevant at higher levels of play, there's absolutely no reason not to go for those early on. Absolutely. And indeed, one of the most common second promotion units, the unit that people promote the second time first, the most often, is indeed a 4-star unit. So there are a lot of people who had this mid-game experience that was a lot of fun, but it just goes away. And my kind of pitch or call to action, certainly if you make games, and as I make games in the future, here's where I think a lot of potential lies for this discussion. We talked a little bit in Liquid's thing about how there are a lot of games currently that as the game's other content kind of wanes, the build systems wax and you get more of those coming online. But it could be the other way. There certainly are games like that. Some games even it out. And then iPatch Notes is introducing this idea of things being kind of time exclusive in a way. You can't have this option now. So what are you going to do now? You can't progress in the story more or do an event that would give you lots of resources or whatever. I think the way to kind of coalesce those into fun is to find a kind of middle rhythm between ongoing games or campaign experiences and roguelikes. So your ongoing game or campaign, you get stuff, and iPatch Notes, you called these permanent progression type of games. Sure. And then you have roguelikes where you inherently reset your stuff every time. And generally, most roguelikes are designed so that one play session is like a full loop. You will have nothing, make a build, and see the build be destroyed within one sit down. Often 20 to 45 minutes, if I were to say. What I'm thinking is to make something in between those two lengths. It does end. It is kind of closer to a roguelike, but it's more like a season. The closest thing I've experienced is Path of Exile, but I didn't really love Path of Exile. A game where things kind of reset in a month type of time interval, 3 months, a month, 2 weeks, not one sit down. A month feels maybe right. A month is a great human unit of time too. I like the idea that you could have a game where you kind of progress as efficiently as you can over time, and then it ends in some way. Now, I think ideally for quality of life, you'd want such a game to give you the resources you can get without you needing to go and farm them. So in Arknights, for example, I would want it to be that you get the same amount of resources by day 5 of the month, regardless of your actions as a player, because otherwise you have to be glued to the game all the time to keep up. Or something like the amount you can get ahead is kind of set. Maybe every week you can get ahead by a little bit, but that takes a reasonable amount of time to do, a roguelike worth of run. And then the content gets harder, every week or something, and you have to decide how to promote units to keep up as per se. You could even make this more of a single player focused experience, not a community experience, and have it be that you can rewind as well. So maybe you say by week 2, it's not going well and I die. I don't get that far. Well, you just reset and a new month starts whenever you're ready. Or you might say, well, this isn't going well. Let me rewind to the previous week, undo all the upgrades I spent between now and then, something like that, and see how you can upgrade your squad or your account, your loadouts, I guess, in a way that, ladders you up the difficulty in a compelling way. This would be a game that really embraces the benefit of weaker options in the game, because not only are they kind of time locked, they may simply not be made available at certain, avenues of play. It also might be that you can't invest in them right now. You will eventually have the resources to invest in them more, but right now you do have to choose, and so it's somewhat tricky. And you could imagine the game having you look ahead as well. Maybe you can only recruit weaker units in the early weeks, but you might really want a few weaker units later that you don't use immediately, so you can promote them, and get an upgrade to your arsenal at a cheap cost in the later weeks when you're running out of resources. You're promoting a ton of people. You just use a few more resources and get a nice promoted unit. I'm mixing a lot of terms for different games because I don't know what this game would be like, but it sounds cool, I think. The idea that there is this further dimension of how you experience games in terms of making builds, where it's like, when does the build stuff happen? I really like this additional dimension where it's, do the games care about the opportunity cost of time as well? Very, very cool. So I'm excited to not make that for years, but then eventually create I mean, I don't know. It's burning a hole in my pocket now. That sounds very cool to me. And it coalesces an idea I'd had much earlier around the time I made that Path of Exile video. Yeah, it's this really cool, a very cool way to put it. I wanted to go back to Liquid's example to bring us on home as well. You gave an example of a more elaborate example of a specific game that you feel like does these build options really well. So I wanted to talk about it a little more. The conspicuous absence you'd said before, for those who know you personally from that list of games you gave before, would be Honkai Star Rail, which for you answers all three questions positively to the strongest degree at this time. I like what's offered on a basic level. Turn-based RPG with a Genshin Impact formula for overall progression, except more streamlined and respectful of your time by design. It certainly is. In a direct comparison, you can argue there's less variety, since things like elemental reactions don't exist, but you can still build teams in many different ways and succeed, particularly once you reach an endgame level. A neat segue into the next question. Can I do a lot of stuff? Yeah, it's built from the ground up for that kind of gameplay loop. Neatly tied with progression. You have your Spiral Abyss equivalent, kind of challenging, resetting every month dungeon thing. Boss encounter rush, maybe. Except it doesn't make you want to die like Spiral Abyss and Genshin Impact does. A side mode focused on killing mobs within a time limit, favoring AoE units. A side mode with souped up bosses, favoring single target characters. So there's always reason to invest and keep coming back. Kind of mirrors that thing Mr. Foot was saying about the idea that the game offering different types of activities can be very healthy for a build system. Cool. Yep. None of these, however, hold a candle to the game's crown jewel of Buildcraft, the simulated universe. This answers the third question rather neatly. Do I feel happy coming back for more? I do. The simulated universe and its offshoots not only have rewards tied to progression, but depending on which offshoot you're picking, rewards tied to different Buildcraft scenarios, different starting conditions, different ending conditions, and higher difficulty levels. There are hundreds of ways you can progress in this Hades-like microgame, and even more ways you can build and progress through any given round. The latest offshoot at the time of writing even explicitly encourages this with a weekly rotation, with preset curios like keepsakes, but stronger and you can get them mid-run, and sometimes blessings, like boons or upgrades in many roguelikes. For example, a weekly rotation about 3 weeks ago at the time of writing had a simple premise: hoard all your money. Here are two curios. One increases your damage based on the amount of money you have, 20% damage bonus per 100 currency. And the other accumulates a percentage of your current money every time you enter a room. So I guess it's like interest. And then you get out there and do a run. You can stumble into a curio that doubles money received, but stops blessings from being acquired as battle rewards, so you have to scale basically pure damage. You can run into an event that doubles your money at the risk of losing it all. You can run into events that give you free money. You can stumble upon a curio that gives you 50% of your current money once. You can stumble into an event that triggers 10 random effects in a row, which can give you money or money-related curios. There are dozens of ways your run could have proceeded, and in your case, you ended with a run that had 49k currency and appropriately melted the final boss with at least a 9,800% damage boost in the end. Since you can save these runs in the latest offshoot for relic farming for that week, farming those specific relics became effortless. It became very easy to get the rest of the rewards from this mode because you did a successful run, a reward for your time and ingenuity, and made progression extremely streamlined for that week. I could talk about example scenarios all day, but I also respect both your time and your previously expressed dislike for the title, despite your best attempts. Suffice to say, I personally find the build system here extremely engaging, but I'm not going to pretend it's for you when you've made clear it really isn't. Just to say as an aside, I mean, unfortunately I don't know. I really didn't like what I played, but I know that I don't know what it would be like when I got to the end game. And I thought that what you have to do to get to the end game was time consuming enough that it's not worth the risk, basically. But that's common. There are plenty of games like that where I think the systems seem cool, or I would really like to know what it would be like on the other side. But I really thought the beginning 20, it could be 50 or longer hours of Honkai Star Rail was just kind of nothing that I had to get through to get to, especially because I played through Genshin Impact's early progression, I guess. Um, to get to a system that I can't ever know I will like until I get there myself. So I just have to kind of hope I'll like it. and I just wasn't willing to take that chance. So don't feel bad. You're not like pushing the issue or something. It's I want to hear about it because I don't want to slog through getting to the point where I can try it myself. I would ideally like to have infinite time and give it a shot. If I had that, one of the early things I would do would be go through this, and Tales of Arise is a game that struck me this way. It had what seemed like an interesting way to incorporate buildcraft with party autonomy. So you're brawling in 3D space, and you have party members that are automated. You can have them prioritize certain behaviors or not. It seemed to me like there might be some kind of system where there's an opportunity cost to giving them more complex commands, which sounds kind of cool. You know, you can't rely on them to heal and do damage, but they'll heal for more or something like that. That sounds maybe neat. I just wasn't willing to go through the unbelievably poorly paced, in my opinion, story uh, to find out, you know, to have it be a risk. And reading this Liquid, I think the thing that makes me the most sad is just how much it highlights to me how much I can't know whether I would like the build experience without more or less doing it myself. This is an admirable example, but still not enough for me to feel like I know whether I would enjoy that. I don't know, when I played Honkai Star Rail, I just didn't see meaningful team building in the turn-based combat that the game offered. It really seemed to me like unless you had a very large variety of gacha units, that is, you have to play quite a lot and have a lot of units on your account, a significant micromanagement cost, you really wouldn't have very many options. And the game seems to heavily punish not having like a variety of units leveled with different elements. A really fascinating thing about Honkai Star Rail compared to Genshin Impact that definitely is something for me that helped me figure out I was maybe going to slightly enjoy Genshin Impact is the way that their element system works. So it's not about reactions here. In Genshin Impact, there are 7 elements a character might be, and enemies are often made of or attuned to one element. Maybe you fight a slime and it's a pyro slime. Well, that enemy can't take pyro damage, but that's it. They can take all of the other kinds of damage. So the game will often say, hey, you get effects from combining multiple elements together. So make a team however you want, combining elements together. But for this fight, you get a bit of a punishment if you use just this one element, just that one, just pyro. You might have made a team that did, you know, a series of reactions. So you're probably using more than one element. Yes, it's not like 1 out of 7 types of characters won't work. You're probably combining multiple elements, but combining other multiple elements will create a different reaction. And so the game might say, well, you've got a good point unit that's electro, and you were doing pyro and electro, but this enemy is immune to pyro. So try electro and something else instead. And those are all good, so that's fine. The game gives you enough of a pressure to switch it up, but little enough that it's still like your teams still matter. It's not going to say you can't use any of the things you've made. You know, we negate most types of damage. You know, there usually just says don't use this one. Honkai Star Rail, it seemed to me, generally instead says do use one of these 2 or 3 types. So similar model. You have, you know, 7-ish, 9. There might be more. It felt like they had left it open that they could add more and more easily. You know, types of damage dealer that you might have. And enemies will have a set of vulnerabilities rather than resistances shown on the enemy to a few of those types. Now, if you use that type of damage, it does tremendously more damage and stagger damage. Like they'll get stunned and lose a turn and you'll get to do more damage. So when I played anyway, and again, for all I know, this could totally change later in the game's progression, but it didn't seem like it would. The game heavily incentivizes you to use one of those 2 or 3, not this one. You see what I mean? And so let's say that you have like 2 or 3 good attacking units. In Genshin Impact, this makes it nearly impossible already that you will ever not be able to use one of those 2 or 3 options, because most fights only say don't use this 1 or maybe 2 elements. And a lot of the time you even can, it's just going to be less damage. Whereas in Honkai Star Rail, the system would often say, well, you can use any type of damage, yes, but you get a, to me it seemed, tremendous advantage, like not manageable to go without advantage, from using one of these 2 or 3 damage types. Therefore, if you have those same 2 or 3 attackers, it's actually quite likely that you won't have one that checks one of those boxes. And the advantage to using one is so great that it seemed not viable to not focus on, building one of those individual attackers. Therefore, I felt like a lot of my team building would be quite regular. Now, Liquid says they feel you can build teams in many different ways and succeed. And I'm sure that that's at least somewhat true, if not also like a reasonable matter of opinion. In that, I mean, you have other characters on a team besides that one character attacking or doing point. I don't know. And you would have to explain the game's systems and teams in exhaustive detail for me to know. You see what I mean? So don't feel bad. I mean, what I will say is that that's where things like the game being a gacha experience, you do randomly roll characters, and I don't think that Genshin Impact is very generous, so I don't have high hopes for Star Rail, which appears to be almost identical in terms of its gacha system. I don't have high hopes at that point, where normally I wouldn't say, well, the game has a gachapon element, that on its own means nothing. But with this additional context, suddenly I think there's a good reason to be worried. And again, this is quite dependent on your situation. I mean, in Genshin Impact, I've played for long enough, I enjoyed the game on its own merits for long enough with the battle pass and the card that I now have such a library of units that only very aggressive power creep would ever make that not sufficient, you know? And so that has kind of ceased to be a factor in Genshin Impact. I don't get the card or the battle pass anymore, and I still enjoy the game just fine, and I'm sure I will for a very long time, because that has kind of been removed as a factor. This is what is so tricky about Liquid, your example of a lot of types of games, Warframe, Elden Ring, the Fallouts, Skyrim, some Fire Emblem entries, not so much Hades, where you get to a point where many of the problems with the game's buildcraft are gone now, but you still can't ever do any of the buildcraft without going through them. Other people can't jump in and do that. And so I do still feel like these games unfortunately get saddled with, you have to decide whether getting through the beginning part is worth it, basically. Additionally, I would say that I didn't really enjoy Genshin Impact's combat even after I got to the end game until I had a lot of things built up. Like, I'm enjoying team building only now that I've done literally everything. Like, now that the game is over, now I think the team building is good. It doesn't really finish happening until I got all the way to the end, in my experience. Which makes it even more troublesome. I think at least in an example like Warframe, I feel like you kind of are making a build in more or less the same way early on. And in a way, Warframe has done something interesting where, because there's not very much opportunity cost, because you have a lot of space in your loadout, and it's often not a trade-off for what you fit in what spot, that element of the game's build enjoyment doesn't have to wait to come online for you to get enough things to fill your whole loadout, because there isn't going to be opportunity cost of much note even when you can fill your whole loadout. So the build experience is appreciable the way it will be eventually, much earlier on. And I would say that was true. I felt like, not within the first few hours, but within the first few weeks of playing Warframe, I was making builds that were meaningful in the same way. They weren't good in the same way, don't get me wrong, but they were meaningful in the same way that they would go on to be with my time playing Warframe. I would say that the game did a better than average job, possibly as a result of not having that opportunity cost, of telegraphing that it was going to be a build experience I would enjoy early on. Whereas a lot of these other games, I hate to say this, I just think in a vacuum, unless there's another reason why you would want to try Genshin Impact or Star Rail, I just think you shouldn't be willing to invest 20, 50 hours into figuring out if maybe you would like that build system. That just is almost objectively not a good choice, in my opinion. It's really only if you happen to get there anyway that it's like, well, it would be awesome if there was a cool build system here. Or if you, again, you somehow have the time. I got through a good amount of Star Rail's early content, so I feel kind of bad. It's like, again, given enough of a rainy day, maybe I would want to get through it, because I would want it to be a good experience. I want to enjoy it, but without the ability to look ahead a little bit, I don't know. I do want to say that for many of these games, I think this is a pretty major flaw as well. It's not just a way the game is. I feel like it is kind of just bad for no real reason. And thinking about it more, the industry thinking about this kind of thing more, hopefully we will get to a point in time where this just largely never happens because I think it's mostly unnecessary. I feel like in many cases you could give the player a taste of that meaningful, build progression or something, some kind of trial or game mode like that. Now, in Genshin Impact, there actually have been a few events that I felt like they give you some trial characters and you muck around and make different teams. And depending on how those events feel as an early game player, maybe that gives you a window. Now, my problem is, so far, they've been very limited time events. And I think that part of the reason that that's important is that if they weren't limited time events, they might feel like, well, I'm just going to play this version of the game and not roll the gacha characters. But these games don't have to be gachapon experiences, and plenty of games that are not gachapon experiences have this problem. So, for many games, I think it would be sufficient to have it be that a quest or a game mode that is available, and maybe you complete it and can't keep doing it, but you get to have an experience early on where you make builds rather unfettered. And so you can see if the game is going to have the build essence that you like early on. You absolutely could do that in these games. They just don't. You could. I don't think there's really any drawback to doing so. In fact, arguably, if you came at the exact right time, Genshin Impact and Honkai Star Rail did very briefly do such a thing. You could argue. But I would want it to go a little further, I guess, and to be a part of the game, not just a temporary event. I don't think it's entirely fair to say that those events were there for early game players to experience. They were there for end game players to notice that they could make more interesting builds and break up the monotony. I think that's why they were put in. But ironically, they were very close to solving a much worse problem that these games have, which is, can you know you would like this within reason without committing a frankly ridiculous amount of your free time into unlocking it? I just want to say quickly that I'm not really specifically to Liquid. I'm sure you seem to understand this. But I can imagine some kinds of players thinking, 20 hours. I mean, you like, games are long sometimes. I believe people have gotten a bit too used to this kind of thing. People have a tendency to say 3 episode test. If it's not good after 3 episodes, then maybe it's not going to be good. I don't know, man. Like, I feel like if you have access to good movies and shows to watch, which you do because it's 2024, I mean, you could have watched a pretty amazing movie in the hour that you were waiting for an anime to get good. That's not a good set of standards to have. Or people will say, like, you stick with it for like 10 hours or whatever. And I think people have come to think that's reasonable. It sounds unreasonable to say, oh, I'm not willing to like wait or whatever. 10 hours is a long time. You can have a lot of really amazing experiences in 10 hours. If you gave me 50 hours of your time and I could make you experience whatever games or media I wanted, you would go to space in that time. I would take you on a trip in that time, and you would then feel it's insane to spend that time on something you don't like the whole time, unambiguously are not enjoying, like hoping that it will have a good, build system. At the very least, most people, I kind of don't, but most people have enough of a Steam backlog that it's insane to not play those games and instead bet on these other games. Do not. That is insane. Again, it's not weird to play Genshin Impact or Honkai Star Rail. I assume the people that played them didn't think that that beginning chunk of time like was a slog. They were enjoying themselves for it. That's awesome. Obviously, that's what's intended. They're not trying to be primarily an interesting build experience, because if they were, they would not hide that 50 hours later. But if there are still really cool build systems and you enjoyed the part before, that's amazing, of course. I used to say about Genshin Impact while I was playing it and enjoying it that I think this is kind of bad on paper. It is not very likely you'll be the person who avoids the problems of this game. But if you just so happen to be enjoying these elements, for example, a funny anecdote to end the discussion. When I was playing Genshin Impact during COVID, my partner at the time was getting into Animal Crossing, as a lot of people were. New Horizons, was that the one that was called? The one on the Switch. And I played Animal Crossing as a teenager a lot. I don't really know why. It doesn't seem like the kind of game I would have liked, but I played a lot of it, I remember, on GameCube. And I was, nostalgic for it. It's a type of game I've enjoyed in the past. But I didn't really want to get into a full Animal Crossing offering. And I do find that being the whole game isn't to my taste currently. You can probably see where this is going. Around that time, Genshin Impact released the Serenity Pot. This is a house for your player character where you can do a mini version of Animal Crossing, more or less. And that was the exact perfect fit for me at this time. I think it is a bad inclusion. And the reason is that you gain significant game affecting resources from progressing in this mode. You don't have to like build a nice house or whatever, but progressing to having a lot of furniture items, and it's called like realm power or something, I forget exactly. Progressing the building thing through its early stages, farming a lot of wood and making a lot of stuff, crafting a lot, doing things utterly unrelated to the rest of Genshin Impact significantly benefits you in the rest of Genshin Impact. For perspective, in these games that usually give you resources per unit of time, stamina or sanity or resin in Genshin Impact, you wait real time and every day you get a certain amount of it to make meaningful progress. If you want to get a meaningful amount of experience or a meaningful amount of new artifacts, gear, you spend this resource. So it gates your progression, right? If you max out your Serenity Pot, you basically gain an eighth day of the week forever by spending all of that time doing that thing. That is a substantial gameplay advantage for every single player of the game, even if they don't want to play Animal Crossing instead of playing Genshin Impact. They want to play Genshin Impact, but now for the eighth day of the week to be unlocked into existence, they will feel like they need to play that side mode or miss out on substantial benefits, especially if you play less. Now that I don't play Genshin Impact every day, I don't keep up with the game all the time. I mean, that eighth day of rewards is automatic. I just log in and get it instantly. That's a huge boon. If I play 1 or 2 days a week, now I play 3 or 4 days a week. That's a massive difference to my experience because I happened to like that at the time. That is not good game design. That is, they wanted to pull in as many people as they could. They thought it would be a good marketing thing. They were probably right. And it sucked some people in, but making it have meaningful rewards in the rest of the game held hostage that aspect of the rest of the game for everybody else. And I think it's the same thing here. For a lot of people, the build system at the end of a game is the fidget toy once you've progressed through like the main body of content. So Star Rail and similar models are probably aiming to get people in the main story. It's a huge, free, and I didn't, but some people really enjoyed it, story. And then once you've been sucked in, there is the build system as a kind of maintenance phase gameplay loop. Weirdly, the problem then could be viewed as, well, if they make that good, then people will say it's good, but you can't go find out for yourself unless you play through this largely unrelated section of the game where you experience the story and level up and stuff. This is not really anyone's fault but the designers. I mean, it's a marketing thing. So Liquid, you certainly don't need to apologize. You're being way overly considerate. It's very kind of you. It's nice that you're acknowledging that I said I probably can't get into it. But I wanted to acknowledge that I think it's completely sensible to enjoy. I think that there are underlying design conflicts there, and it really interested me how a lot of the examples you gave are games like this, so I hope it doesn't offend you for me to assume. I think you might make a decent example of someone who is used to that model, and if you're liking the early game part of the progression and then you also enjoy the build experience, yeah, I mean, there's really no problem. Thankfully, these have been enjoyable for a lot of people. But I do still think that on paper, that design does hold the build system hostage a little bit. An interesting phenomenon. So I'm happy that you took the time to detail that specific example. But for what it's worth, I don't want to overreact and make it sound like that gives me no information about whether I would enjoy it. Just that these are not the things I would want out of the game to enjoy. Like it would be, it's all about that, like, how can you build different kinds of teams in many different ways? I will say, I hope it doesn't offend you specifically, Liquid. I will put my cards on the table. I believe it is explainable. Like, I don't need to go into the game to get that explanation. And my end game is that if I can do that well for all of you at some point, well, maybe eventually you all actually can do it well for me, or I could at least find someone who would. It's I do think it's possible. I would not say that it is accessible. I feel like we need to prepare significantly. And this kind of conversation did a lot to do that. So thank you very much for submitting responses, folks. I really enjoyed them. This was a gold mine of stuff. Absolutely. Folks, if you'd like to join in on Crew Parley, this is a $5 tier reward. So I did that partly because that's just a really large group of people. If you are a Twitch subscriber, if you're a Twitch Prime subscriber, that I count as my $5 reward. If your Discord account and your Twitch account are connected, you get that. I treat you as if you're a $5 patron because I get a similar amount of money. So you can go to the Discord, and there's a Crew Parley channel that is unlocked if you're a $5 or up patron. And you can just click on the thread for each month. So I put up the one for October already, and submit something. I will, yeah, let's do this. I'll read the prompt for October as a little bit of an ad as well. So here's my prompt for October 2024 that you can submit to right now. Many games want to leave the player a breadcrumb trail of rewards to keep them going. We talked about a lot in this previous parlay. A lot of games also have build systems with lots of different pieces to mix and match. Hey, look, a whole bunch of breadcrumb-sized rewards. Let's use those for that. And so it happened. A huge majority of games, at least in my experience, do things this way. We talked about it a bit in Mr. Food's example in this parlay, where a game will be like, maybe it's got a lot of puzzles it wants you to solve, and it wants a reward to put there, and look, there's a build system there, why don't we put those rewards in there? Something like that. But there's a snag, I say. The activity of making a build involves knowing what's out there, to some extent. And some aspects of making a build, like opportunity cost, don't fire unless the build pieces that would create the opportunity cost are, well, available to the player. What do you think of this compromise? I bet many games and players and developers don't see it as a compromise. Do you? Do you have a solution where we could have our breadcrumbing and eat our builds too? The idea being, I hope it makes sense, that having the build pieces be rewards for a different activity inherently locks the build system behind some potentially unrelated activity. But the build pieces are kind of needed to make that activity rewarding. And again, in many cases, a game might think, well, but we want you to experience the whole game anyway, so it's fine for those things to be related. They're related, but looking at it more cynically, they're attached, they're locked together, shackled together. And I want to know what people think about this conflict. It actually came up a lot in this parlay, and I didn't plan that at all. So I'm very pleased to find that this was an elegant segue. Looking forward to your responses if you'd like to do them. Yeah, again, and I'll look forward to them and make a video out of them this time next month. If you want to become a $5 patron or some equivalent, you can also do that using a link in the description. I'd love to have you. But yeah, this will be here to listen to regardless. Looking forward to it. Talk to you next time, folks.